Chapter 17 is rolling two connected things in together. One is kind of a big picture, historical, grand movement kind of item, and the other one has to do with a particular denominational family that we haven't talked about yet, the Baptists. And if you were going to look at the American religious landscape right now, you would probably want to start with the Baptists along with the Catholics, in part because the largest religious body in the United States right now is the Roman Catholic Church. The second largest is the Southern Baptist Convention. And a few of the other Baptist conventions are in the top 10 as well. The National Baptist Convention, National Baptist Convention Incorporated. And then there's a few other Baptist bodies that are also pretty large. And, you remember from that chapter that Baptists were actually a very tiny group in early America. They didn't have a huge role. That's fine. There's always going to be some noise going on. So what we're going to be interested in here is where did they come from, first off? Because there's a lot of different origin stories. And then what made them Baptists, what made them distinctively a tradition, and how did they end up growing? How did they end up becoming an important part of the landscape? So let's start with this question, where did they come from? And your book actually doesn't go into this too much. It just gives you one of the answers. But if you ask within Baptist communities, you will sometimes get other views about this. And one of these is what's called the successionist view. Think back to gospel stories, and think about Baptists. Why are Baptists why is the act of baptism so important? Anybody remember from like Sunday school or CCD or things like that? Why did early Christians think this was important? Yeah.
To get rid of our original sin.
That's sort of an explanation later on that comes in, and that's very important. Yeah.
No, isn't how John knew Jesus was the Son of God?
There's that incident, yeah, and John is Jesus' cousin, and he's out there preaching already. He's out in the wilderness and saying repent, and he's baptizing all these people. And these people that he's baptizing are Jewish. He may have been tied in with the Essene movement. We're not really actually sure. People have theories one way or the other. Jesus comes to him, and you're right. There's that, John. There's this heavens open up incident, and John gives way basically to Jesus after he baptizes him, and so that became a central act for Christians, for nearly all the Protestants, despite what they may have gotten rid of from previous church traditions. They held on to that very firmly. And some of the Baptists would say that they actually could trace their roots back to John the Baptist, that there was a succession of churches going all the way back. Historically, there's no evidence for this. And it's a minority view among Baptists, but there are some still who maintain that to this day. Did the Baptists come from the Anabaptists? The name would kind of suggest that. The practice of baptizing as adults would kind of suggest that. So some people actually thought the Baptists did in fact come, sort of like a direct route from the Anabaptists. But what we know is that's not actually the case. They're actually coming from the Puritans. And they're coming from the Puritans in England. The book kind of gives you the impression that they're starting out here in the United States, but the movement really, strictly speaking, is getting started in England. And remember we talked about some of the differences with the Puritans. Some of them were like strict separatists. You got to separate the church from the state altogether. Church of England is totally corrupt. Others thought you could kind of reform it from within. They wanted to purify it. So these are some of the separatists, the Puritans. And what's peculiar to them is this emphasis on baptism, on baptism of adults. Most of the Puritans stuck to the old Reformed view, which was that, if there's one thing that the Catholics and then, the Anglicans and Lutherans didn't get wrong, it was that children should be baptized, as infants. So these guys actually, they don't get a lot of traction at first. They're a tiny sliver, a real minority movement. And your book then talks about somebody who played an important role in American history, this guy Roger Williams. You'll remember back when I was talking about the Puritans, when we were looking at that in an earlier chapter, I said that Rhode Island was kind of a haven. If you couldn't fit into the Puritan way of life, they would kick you out if they disliked you enough. And a lot of the people that they kicked out went off to Rhode Island, which at that time was more or less a wilderness. Now it's pretty nice. There's a lot of posh places in some parts of it. But back then it was another place you could go, and that's where you would go if you didn't fit in religiously. So a lot of these separatist Baptists, that's where they ended up finding their place. And like your book points out, for a while it's just two churches. There's not much going on. Baptist life was rather sleepy, confined to the two venerable churches in Providence and Newport, the two main cities of Rhode Island, and a few scattered congregations. This Great Awakening that we're talking about, that's what gets them moving. And the Baptists then start getting very enthusiastic about the revival. Some of the main traits of the Great Awakening are things that become very important for Baptist spirituality. And then you get a couple other distinctions coming in that your book talks about. These aren't that important for understanding who the Baptists are today, because they don't generally think in these terms. They are important for understanding the history of the Baptists in the United States and the things that divided Baptists from one another. Some of the things. One of the main things that's going to divide them is slavery, actually. But they talk about separate and general and particular Baptists. Now, the general and particular, that's referring to a split that's taking place in theology between Arminian or free will views and Calvinist views. Remember, they were Puritans originally, so they're Calvinists originally. Bless you. The separate Baptist, that just refers to this sort of tradition of, churches should be completely separate from the civil order. They tend to be part of what's called the free church movement. And the free church movement tends to view things sort of like this. And this is very characteristic of Baptists. You have individual churches, and those churches, each one of them is its own unit. Each one of them has its own congregation, its own way of doing things. What happens in this church is not necessarily reflective of what's going to happen in this church. If they believe some doctrine over here, and you don't like that doctrine, that's fine. Just don't go to their church. Go to this one over here. Now, if those churches want to get together into an organization, that's okay. That's what's called, in Baptist terms, over time, a convention. So when you hear about Southern Baptist Convention, that's a huge association of all these churches. Nowadays it's done at the state level and then at the national level. Right? So the Southern Baptist Convention is actually a bunch of state conventions together, and each of those is a whole bunch of churches. But if a church decides they don't like what's going on with this higher level of authority, they say, fine, we're going our own particular way. The separate Baptists never really formed together. They always remained sort of, not disintegrated, not disorganized, but they just thought that things are better handled at the congregational level. There were associations of the general and particular Baptists, and your book talks about some of the interplay between them. There was often quite a lot of bad blood between them as well, because they're arguing over issues of salvation, over who is actually saved and who isn't, and how you have to live in order to be a Christian. Now, one thing that you can say, and this is the last thing that I'll say about Baptists at this point, about all these groups, all these Baptist groups, is that, you remember when I talked about Methodism being a very portable religion? Being easy to take out to the frontier? Think about Baptist Christianity that way as well. If you don't have to have bishops, and you don't have to have an official doctrine that every church has to agree to, and you don't even have to have some sort of organized system of education, and each congregation can do its own thing, it's very easy to start a new church, isn't it? You just, send a few people out to the frontier and build a building, get together, bring a few Bibles, that might be helpful too, right? And now you've got a church. And so as opposed to some of the other churches like the Lutherans or the Anglicans or even the Presbyterians where it was harder to move it out to the American frontier, the Baptists, the Methodists, they could get out there immediately. And they were sort of following the movement along the frontier. So as the population is shifting westward, those areas, and also southward into, the Appalachians and the southern colonies, those areas are being developed, let's say, religiously, by the congregations or the denominations that can move out easier, particularly the Baptists. So we see incredible growth among Baptists in the 17th and 18th, the 1700s and 1800s, not the 17th and 18th century, but the 18th and 19th century. Now, I talked about the Baptists first, in part because I wanted to get them kind of out of the way as a denomination. Let's talk now about this Great Awakening business. So, this is a movement that's taking place in America. It's got some roots in other places as well. But it's taking place within the churches that are already there and already established. And it's taking place across churches. So it's not just a Puritan thing, it's not just a Presbyterian thing, it's not just an Anglican thing or a Methodist thing. All these people are talking back and forth to each other. You could think of it in a certain way as like a second Protestant Reformation. The book doesn't go quite that far in talking about it that way. But you could think of it like that. There's this incredible sense of huge changes taking place. And your book mentions a number of important people and a number of different aspects to this. So, one of the key things, we talked about this before, is the tension between the heart and the head. The Great Awakening was about a religion of the heart. And what did that involve? We spelled this out a little bit last class, or the class before. What do you associate with the heart, besides Valentine's Day?
Cupid.
Cupid? Did you say? Did you say Cupid?
Yeah.
That makes sense. Again, that's part of the Valentine's Day imagery. What does Cupid do?
Makes people in love.
Yeah. Now, love is what? Something that drives you crazy. I'm looking for the general thing that it fits into. What is love?
Emotion.
An emotion, right. So they talk in terms of religious affections. The term that we use today is emotions. And love is one of the emotions that they want to cultivate. It's not about cultivating hate or anger or fear necessarily, although some of them did focus quite a bit on fear of God. But it's about love. It's about compassion. It's about feeling a connection with other people and feeling a connection with God. Not just thinking about a connection, not just having faith in a connection, but actually feeling it. So, let's look at a few other things that they talk about. I'm going to skip over the geographical stuff. We can come back to that. They talk about this as being a massive religious revival that sweeps over the entire Atlantic coast. And it elevates the personal, intense religious experience of emotional, here's another important term, conversion. Conversion is turning to God and commensurately away from some other thing. So if you're converting, what would you be turning away from? When people convert, and they have a conversion experience, and they say, I found Jesus, I now have a personal relationship with Jesus. What sort of things aren't they, at least openly doing anymore? You guys have experience with this? With people, saying, I've had a religious experience? Or is that kind of foreign to you? It doesn't happen as much. It certainly doesn't happen like it did during the Great Awakening, when this was very common. Away from, however you want to conceive of it, away from sin, away from the world, away from evil, away from bad things. And this is something that's intensely emotional. It's also very personal. If I'm going to be converted, that has to happen for me. And the fact that he's converted doesn't have anything to do with me necessarily. His relationship with God is his relationship with God. Mine is, the one that I have. We could talk about it. Maybe he can, enlighten me about his own. But ultimately, it's up to what I do, what I feel, what happens with me. And like your book mentions, in important movements, like with Luther, Martin Luther had that kind of experience, and he wrote about it. But we're all Lutherans saying, hey, I got to have this experience like Martin Luther. No, it's good enough that Luther had that experience. He had some insights that came out of that, and then they go on with that practice within that tradition. With this, the emphasis is different. Everybody should have this. Everybody should experience themselves their own conversion, their own personal, emotive relationship with God. Now, your book talks about a few important people involved with this, and we talked about one of these guys already, or his family rather, the Tennants. They were Presbyterians. And you remember we talked about the Log College and his sermon, The Dangers of an Unconverted Ministry. He was pushing for this sort of thing. He was saying, if you don't have this kind of experience, you probably shouldn't be a preacher. You shouldn't be out there doing stuff. And then it talks about this guy, Frelinghuysen, who's Dutch Reformed minister. Not quite so important because the Dutch Reformed were not that representative. And then it talks about this guy, who I'm a big fan of actually, Jonathan Edwards. Edwards is actually a Puritan. He's a Congregationalist. And he's also the first American philosopher, in any real sense. He's, I won't say the father of American philosophy, because not everybody followed his views, but he was a guy who was very well trained academically. He was a preacher, he was a theologian, he was a philosopher, he wrote a lot, he organized a lot, he had a huge influence. And Edwards, like it says, his role in the revival was really crucial. He was one of its most effective preachers. He had a congregation, and he wrote sermons that we still have today as part of American literature. If you've ever read The Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is a great read, talks about, the human being is like a spider suspended over the fire by the hand of God, and who knows why God isn't throwing us in there. It's very, very imagistic, very stark, right? And the idea is to try to produce this conversion experience. So he's an important preacher. He wants to bring about a change of consciousness in his listeners. He's focused on the emotions. He actually writes a whole book about the religious emotions called On the Religious Affections. And he tries to use imagery, metaphor. So that's part of what makes him such a great literary thinker. He's also somebody like John Wesley who's very good at organizing things. If you want to have a movement, it's not enough to have some great ideas. You actually have to have some organizational capacity, the kind of things that we actually teach about in business classes or in organizational psychology classes. A lot of people have a kind of native skill for this, and Edwards is one of those. Now, what he did is he developed, like the book says in classic form, a sort of restatement of the essentials of Calvinism in a philosophical form that reflected his thought and experience and would lead to this sort of thing. Edwards also focused very much on the relationship between God and the individual, The Puritans have been talking about covenant. Remember, a covenant is a sort of agreement between people. So if we're one Puritan church, what you do over there reflects on me. Because we're all in a covenant together with God, and we're all in a covenant together with each other. With Edwards, you're sort of taking out the middleman. It's much more about the individual's relationship with God. So he's a major player. And then the guy who, we're sort of like going from, I should actually be going from the bottom to the top. As we go in order of importance, we have this other guy, George Whitefield. And Whitfield is all over the map. He starts out as an Anglican, has an intense conversion experience like this, sees a lot of other people having that sort of stuff. He was an extraordinarily gifted preacher. You may, when you read this in your book, you may think, those people were a bunch of rubes or suckers. When you hear that he could reduce an audience to tears simply by pronouncing the word Mesopotamia, but he appeared to have some sort of charisma. He could take a crowd and just hold them in the palm of his hand. You know how some people are just excellent speakers? You can listen to them all day long. You find yourself, even if you disagreed with them at the start, sort of agreeing after a while. He was one of those guys. And even Benjamin Franklin found himself. And Benjamin Franklin was a hardcore, pretty secular guy. Benjamin Franklin, by the way, liked to do a lot of things that we don't normally think of him doing. You should read about him sometime. Find out that he was actually involved in a lot of different things besides just electricity and independence. He was even almost converted by Whitfield. So that's going pretty far. Whitfield revolutionizes preaching. And he, when somebody comes on the scene and they manage to really hold the public's attention and do something new, what happens after that? You get a lot of imitators, don't you? A lot of people say that's the way to go. Whitfield's example influences generations of preachers down to this day, particularly in the Baptist tradition. So Whitfield, like it says, was known as the grand itinerant, the preacher who goes from place to place to place. That just wasn't done in those days. You might, if you were a preacher, you might go to somebody else's church, but you would go there by invitation. You wouldn't be wandering around looking for people just to, listen to you wherever you went. That was kind of frowned upon. And we'll talk about why in just a moment. So Whitfield, like your book points out, is really, in large respect, America's first celebrity. You guys have all heard the phrase "famous for being famous." It's said about Paris Hilton, and now it's said about all sorts of people. Whitfield's the first person you can say that about in America. A lot of people who didn't know him knew of him and then wanted to know him. And so he could go pretty much anywhere he wanted and find a following. In part because of his great gifts, in part because what he was doing was catching on. So now there were several different main features of the preaching that's taking place. And Whitfield is responsible for some of these. The Tennants are also responsible for some of these. Your book talks about, and I like this word, censurious preaching. What is it? Do you guys know this term, to censure? To censure somebody? It's bad when that happens to you. It means that some organized body is saying, we don't like this guy. He's done such and such things. Like the Senate can censure you. And I think the House of Representatives can. I don't know. Somebody's a poli-sci major. Maybe they can fill me in on whether that's the case. And it's not like disciplining you. It's more like saying you're bad for these reasons. George Tennant was saying that about other preachers. He was saying that about the religious establishment. He was saying, look, unless you've had this conversion experience, unless you have this passion driving your preaching, you're no good. So you can imagine that didn't go over all that well with many people, right? Because when you tell people that they're doing the wrong thing, how do they usually react to you? Do they usually say, I'm so happy that you filled me in. Now I know exactly what I should be doing. Thank you for that. Is that your ordinary experience? What do you guys more generally experience? How do people react? Yeah.
They usually get like pretty defensive and kind of guard their own views about why they're right.
Yeah, that's a good term for it, defensive. They see you as attacking them, not as trying to help them out, but just attacking them, and then they will often go on the attack with you. And that's part of what's happening with this. There's a few other important features. So we have this now I always misspell this word, itinerant. See? I already itinerant. Preaching. So that's wandering around from place to place. Another thing that's tied in with this is lay preaching. And when we see this term lay, you should think laity, think about the people who haven't been to seminary, the people who don't have special training. They just have some sort of calling or gift or feeling that they should be preaching. So any of you could be a lay preacher, even though you don't have a theology degree. I don't know, maybe some of you do have a theology degree, but I suspect not. All it would take is for you to feel like you were actually called to do so. And then they talk about extempore preaching. Do you guys know this word, this extempore? It's coming from Latin stuff as usual. Extempore preaching is when you don't have a set lecture in front of you. You just start. You say, today we're going to talk about this incident in the Gospel of John. And you just start talking. And you start connecting things together. In academics, it would be how many of you have to do presentations in classes? So many classes. Do you like doing presentations? No? Why not?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, because you shook your head so vehemently.
I don't like talking in front of people.
That's a big one for a lot of people. You can get over that if you do it enough, but it takes a while. Why else don't you like doing presentations? Or is that the main reason? Are there other reasons you don't like to do it? Yeah.
You kind of know what you're talking about.
That's a big one. You really have to know what you're talking about, or else somebody's going to say, hey, you don't know what you're talking about. And maybe a professor gives you a bad grade, or students make fun of you, or something like that. Any other reasons? Yeah.
I don't like doing it with groups because I can't control what other people say.
Yeah. Professors are convinced that students love group work. Students hate group work for a variety of reasons. I don't mean to generalize about all of you, but there's always somebody who doesn't do their job, and yeah, you're right. You can't control what other people are going to say. Now, in this case, if you were the preacher, you're the only guy up there, so that wouldn't be so much of an issue. But that fear of public speaking or reticence about it, that need to really know what you're talking about. Most preachers at that time would have a written sermon. They would write it out beforehand. That's why we have their sermons. And then they would read it. They would just get up there and read through the whole thing. Imagine like if today's lecture was just me opening, okay, everyone open the textbook to page 141. We'll now begin with the Great Awakening and the Baptist tradition. The rise and spread of Pietism and Methodism, along both, and now imagine I do this in a monotone, that would be a long hour, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
If you do know what you're talking about, and in order to talk about conversion, you'd actually have to have a conversion, right? If you do know what you're talking about, you can speak extempore. You can talk at length about things and start putting things together on the fly. George Whitefield was an expert at this. There's a lot of other people who are good at this. And, for a lot of Christian churches, it would be crazy to bring in a sermon that's written out. That would be a sign that you really don't know your stuff, that it hasn't become part of who you are. that you're not, to use one of the phrases, on fire for the word. So this is a new style of being a preacher, a new style of doing things. This leads to a lot of splits in religious denominations. It talks about the old side and the new side, the old lights and the new lights. Generally, the old are going to be the ones who are not in favor of doing this very emotional kind of stuff. And the new ones are the ones who are in favor of it. So sometimes it actually led to splits in the particular churches. So your book talks about, bless you, what did this actually pan out as? What did this turn into? It affected religious life in all the congregations, and it left these lasting marks in a new conception of how the person who's doing the preaching ought to be behaving. Bless you.
Thanks.
There's going to be a second great awakening coming after this. This shakes things up in a lot of denominations. So we'll see how this plays out as we go into other chapters.